Thank you, Doctor. Thank you very much, Dr. Mason. Thanks to you and to Olga of the World Affairs Council, and also one of your faculty, Dr. Barron. Thank you both for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with you. The subject of my talk today is the 100 Years' War of the 20th century. We are all taught that World War I and World War II and the Cold War were separate and distinct wars with beginnings and ends. I don't see it that way. And I think that the further we get away from the 20th century, the more historians will see that century the way I do. And I'm just going to tell you how I see it, and in the process highlight what the foreign and national security policies of the United States were during the 20th century, from roughly 1900 to roughly 2000. I argue that it was a single war that lasted almost a century. If you define it in strictly American terms, and I tend to do that, being an American, it was the 100 Years' War against European totalitarianism. If you define it, I think, from a European point of view, you might say it was a 100 Years' War, a 100 years struggle for the soul of Europe. 3 times during the 20th century, tyrannical, aggressive, militaristic thought systems and countries attacked out of the eastern central part of Europe toward the west. All 3 times, the leaders of these countries and movements were autocrats. Kaiser Wilhelm and the militaristic Germany, Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, and Joseph Stalin and his successors, and Soviet communism. In all 3 cases, the attacks were from the east to the west. In all 3 cases, the aggressors were autocrats. In all 3 cases, they attacked and seriously threatened those democracies that did exist in Europe, particularly Great Britain and France. And in all 3 cases, the United States was central to the outcome of the conflict, and increasingly so as the century wore on. So, what I see is the 100 Years' War in 3 phases, not 3 separate wars. So let me defend my thesis. What did the world look like in 1900? Well, in the latter part of the 19th century, say the 1890s and the early part of the 20th, the world was changing extraordinarily rapidly. New weapons of mass destruction, as we would say today, were being introduced. For instance, automatic weapons, the machine gun, rifled artillery that could fire thousands of yards, poison gas, the submarine, the tank, the airplane, and railroad systems which could mobilize million-man armies in a matter of weeks. And all of this was happening in a world in which the leaders had only known horseflesh, swords, and single-shot rifles. The leaders of that time felt extraordinarily threatened by the development of these new weapons of mass destruction. And I should also mention, of course, maybe the most important of them all, at least psychologically, was the dreadnought, the giant battleship that could go anywhere and was unsinkable, could destroy coastlines, and could destroy all international shipping. The leaders were frightened. Well, who were these leaders? At that time, there were 6 major powers, and only 6. They were the British Empire, French Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Turkish or Ottoman Empire. The United States was in a state of becoming, as was Japan, but neither one was a major power, and China was a chaotic mess. Those were the 6 powers, these major powers of the day, and I just would point out to you that not one of them is a major power today, and that was only 100 years ago. Well, the reality was that there wasn't one of those major powers who could dominate the others single-handedly. So, all 6 major powers needed allies, and there was a very intense period during those 20 years from 1890, say, to 1907, 8, or 9, of diplomatic activity in which 3 basic alliances were sorted out. On the one hand was the Entente Cordiale, the French and the British democracies, later joined by the Soviet Empire. And on the other hand were the Central Powers, Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Turkey. Central Powers, the Allies. As the century rolled on, the world seemed to them, and I think rightly so, to be more and more dangerous. And they reacted to it the only way that they could, by making their alliances tighter and tighter, such that by the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, an attack against one of the members of these two alliances was an attack against all. And the world was, in fact, there were two coiled steel springs ready and waiting to explode, and they were just waiting for something to cause the explosion, and that something, of course, was the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, who was the heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, by a Serbian terrorists, we've heard of those in the 1990s, at a place called Sarajevo, which we also heard about in the 1990s. When that happened, Austria mobilized against Serbia and published a series of demands which the Serbians could not accept and remain independent, and so they refused them and called on their Russian allies, their Slav brothers, to support them, which they did. The Austrians then called on the Germans, and the other members of the two alliances were automatically required to join by their treaty obligations, and they did. And within a very short time after this early mid-August incident, everybody was mobilizing. And once the mobilizations had started, there was really no way to stop them. And so World War I began, or what I would call the first phase of the 100 Years' War. You all know roughly the military history of that. The Germans and the French clashed near the French border with a British expeditionary force supporting the French. Both armies headed toward the Atlantic coast, and they both arrived there at the same time. And very quickly, the whole front, from the North Sea to Switzerland, became stabilized in a trench warfare situation, which was incredibly bloody. I've visited several World War I battlefields, and it's almost unthinkable if you can picture in your mind what actually happened on those plains 80 years ago. In any case, they slaughtered each other at the tactical level for several years without much result. At the strategic level, the British, the Entente Cordiale, the Allies, the policy of the Allies was to blockade Germany with a surface fleet, which they did reasonably effectively. The German response to that was to blockade Great Britain with a submarine fleet, an underseas fleet, which they did increasingly effectively as the war went on. The problem for the Germans was that in order to really isolate Great Britain commercially and economically, they had to sink neutral ships, among them American ships. And increasingly, the United States, which began just wanting to have nothing to do with this, was drawn into it by events. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson ran on a plank of too proud to fight. And his other plank was, he kept us out of war. He ran on a Pacific platform, and he won in 1916. He won the presidency. Before 4 months had passed, he was being pushed reluctantly, but decreasingly reluctantly, into confronting the German situation. Two things happened early in 1917 which turned the United States around. And by the way, foreign policy in that era, the policy process was when President Wilson sat down and thought about something and then wrote it down on a piece of paper and then made a speech. That was how policy was formulated. He had some input from his ambassadors, but essentially it was a one-man show. And early in 1917, the German government was involved in a very serious internal debate. And the debate was, shall we declare unrestricted submarine warfare and try to enforce the isolation and the financial collapse and trade collapse of Great Britain, and risk America's entering the war? Or shall we not, and run the risk that America will enter the war anyway, because it was clear that we were going to enter the war on the side of the British? So the Germans had a huge strategic problem. The question was, which way are they going to go? And there were voices in the German government who, particularly the foreign minister, the Reichschancellor, who were opposed to unrestricted submarine warfare. The military were in favor of it. The Kaiser sided with the military, and unrestricted submarine warfare was declared in, I think it was February. At about the same time, the secretary of the German Foreign Ministry, the number 2 man, a chap named Zimmermann, drafted a telegram to his ambassador in Mexico in which he said, "Mr. Ambassador, you are instructed to inform the government of Mexico that we will offer them all necessary military and other support if they will invade the United States and reclaim Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and California, which were taken away from them in the War of 1846 and its aftermath." The problem that Mr. Zimmermann had that he didn't know about was that the British Navy was reading his diplomatic, they had broken the diplomatic code, and the Brits were reading his mail. And the minute that this cable was sent to Washington, the British knew that they had a huge key to getting America into the war in their hands, and they did 2 things. They informed President Wilson, and they leaked it to the New York Times. They wanted it in the public domain. They weren't prepared to risk that Wilson would not publish it. And so the minute that the people of the United States discovered that the Germans were messing around with our southern border and talking in terms of violence in that quarter, that added to submarine warfare unrestricted, made it impossible for Wilson to resist, and reluctantly, but in my judgment correctly and bravely, he asked for a declaration of war from the Congress of the United States. And on April 17th, and this is very important, Wilson may have been a prickly prig of a Princeton professor. I'm a Princetonian, so I can say things like that. But he was a man who saw a long way. He had great vision. And here's what he said. April 17th, 1917, to a joint session of Congress. "We are glad to fight thus for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its peoples, the German people included. The world must be made safe for democracy." What is it, 2 sentences? In those 2 sentences, he elaborated the 3 basic points of what would be America's foreign policy for 100 years. The first point was liberty, liberation of peoples. The second point was democracy, and the third point was do not destroy your enemies, treat them decently. He included the German people and their betterment as a cause for why we were fighting. This was very radical revolutionary thinking for the late imperialist era. But his eloquence helped to mobilize the American people, and it helped to mobilize a lot of foreigners who read where the president stood, and this policy declaration was further amplified by the 14 points, open covenants openly arrived at, freedom of the seas, by which he meant freedom of trade, self-determination, at least within Europe, and an international order, the League of Nations, the 14 points. Well, the Americans mobilized eventually over 1 million men, but that took a while. And the Germans knew, once Wilson had called for this declaration of war, which he received, by the way, the Germans knew that it was only a matter of time for them. They knew they could not resist 1 million fresh troops. Just no way physically to do that. And good troops. And so in the spring of 1917, they began planning a huge offensive, which they started early in 1918, and they threw everything they had into the fight. And they had a lot, because in the meantime, they had helped to get to get the Tsar overthrown in Russia, and Russia was out of the war, so they had no Eastern Front to worry about. All of their men and all their material was thrown into the Western Front, and it was, by that time, American troops were arriving and were being killed, and General Pershing was resisting the piecemeal entry of companies and regiments of American soldiers. He wanted them to fight as a national unit, but with this spring offensive, he had no choice, and our troops were involved in stopping it, but they did stop it. It took several months, but the Germans only gained 40 miles in what became known as the Soissons salient, and the front again stabilized. And then in the summer of 1918, with the Americans fighting as a national unit, the Allies attacked. And we attacked in a very concentrated area around Château-Thierry, the Balou Wood, and the Meuse, across the Meuse River and into the Argonne Forest. And essentially, once that attack started, it never stopped. We just kept going, and so did the rest of the Allies who were part of the attack. That was in August. Within a very few months, truce negotiations were underway. Germany was collapsing economically and politically, and the Allies and the Central Powers agreed that at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month, November 11th, 1918, that a truce would be declared and enforced. And every day after that, the Allies advanced 11 miles into previously German-held territory until they occupied all of Germany. It was a huge military victory. The question was, who's going to win the peace? And Wilson had mobilized, in a popular sense, the world behind his 14 points. But popular acclaim only impacts foreign policy up to a point. And the three Allied leaders, apart from Wilson, Clemenceau for the French, Lloyd George for the British, and Orlando for Italy, were all intent on destroying Germany. Wilson was not. They were intent on a punitive peace. They were intent on keeping their empires intact and taking the pieces of the other empires. Wilson was not. And they were lukewarm about a League of Nations, and Wilson was not. And so he did what he could, but eventually, as you all know, he was outgunned. And at the end of the day, he gave up most of his 14 points in return for agreement on the League of Nations. And he brought the treaty, the Versailles Treaty, which was signed by all, including the Germans, back to the United States for Senate confirmation. He did not receive that. He was defeated by a surge of isolationist sentiment led by Senator Lodge of Massachusetts and others, and was overwhelmed. And the Senate never did approve the treaty. And the Warren Harding was elected in 1920, and the United States returned to, what did he call it, normalcy? It was really isolationism. And the Europeans imposed the kind of a peace that they wanted, which was a destructive one. And they took away Germany's industrial, the Saar and the Rhineland, which were territorially and ethnically German, and neutralized them. And Germany was required to pay huge reparations. And essentially, what the Allied policy amounted to was destroying the economically most important country in Europe. And that, having done that, they were then on the way to destruction themselves. And the failure of the Allies to win the peace, as it were, in 1918 and 19, led directly to the second phase of the 100 Years' War, and that started less than 20 years later. Within a decade, Hitler was scheming to rearm Germany. Within a decade and a half, he was rearming Germany. In 1935, they marched into the, I believe it was 35, they marched into the Rhineland. The Allies did nothing. They took the Rhineland back, got a big piece of their industrial capacity back. They insisted on a referendum in the Saarland, which was held, and Saarland being German, everyone voted to go back to Germany. And then 37 and 38, the Anschluss in Austria, the Allies did nothing. In late 38, the meeting at Munich, at which Neville Chamberlain and the French foreign minister gave further concessions to Hitler, allowing him to take all of the mountainous border regions of Czechoslovakia, which made Czechoslovakia essentially undefendable. And only finally in 1939 did they realize that appeasement wasn't going to work, and when Germany, continuing the outline that Hitler had published in his book, Mein Kampf, they invaded Poland. And the French and the British, consistent with their treaty requirements, came to the assistance of Poland. And the second phase of the 100 Years' War, violent phase, was underway. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because in a lot of ways it's the third phase that's most important to us. However, I have to say that probably the summer and fall of 1940 was the greatest moment for the English-speaking peoples. What happened was that the German war machine just rolled over everything in Europe. And within a matter of months, they controlled everything from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees Mountains north to south, and everything from the English Channel to somewhere, well, they hadn't really attacked Russia yet by 1940, but to the borders of Russia in the east, except for Switzerland and Sweden, ineffective neutrals. Great Britain stood alone against the mightiest war machine that the world had ever known up to that point. But Britain produced a great leader. Winston Churchill stood up and he shook his fist at them and he dared them to come across that channel. And he made it very clear what was waiting for them. They were going to fight them on the beaches, fight them in the villages, fight them in the streets, fight them in the air, on the land, and on the sea. And Hitler knew that he had to get control of the air. There was no way he was going to cross the English Channel as long as the British Navy was still afloat and the Royal Air Force was still in the skies. And so the Battle of Britain in the summer and fall of 1940 was fought. Basically, it was a bloody draw. But the Germans, and they made a strategic mistake as well. Instead of going after the airfields, they decided to bomb cities and kill civilians. Mistake. But in any case, since it was a draw and since they were on the attack, they lost. And Hitler did not invade Great Britain, and he very quickly turned his interest to the Soviet Union. And in the summer of 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, of course, nobody knew it at the time, but the war was essentially over. The German army washed up against Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Stalingrad in the south, and they never did take any of those three cities. And they expended millions, well, hundreds of thousands of men trying. At that point, the war in Europe was essentially over. There was a lot of blood to come in North Africa, in Italy and Sicily, and of course the invasion of Europe. But from a strategic point of view, it was over. The Asian part of the war, which we know very well, began for us on December 7th, 1941. When we were attacked, Roosevelt asked for a declaration of war against Japan, interestingly, only. He did not ask for a declaration of war against Germany. And he got that declaration of war, and 3 days later, the Germans declared war on us. You might call that another strategic error. Because had they not done so, we might have dithered around for another 6 or 8 or 12 months going into the field against the Germans. But as it was, we were in the field against everybody very quickly. The Japanese failed to take out our aircraft carriers. And 6 months after Pearl Harbor, at the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway, the United States carrier fleet destroyed the Japanese carrier fleet's offensive thrust by taking down 5 of their 6 mainline carriers, but more importantly than that, by destroying hundreds and hundreds of aircraft and hundreds of their best fighter pilots. And you can build a new airplane pretty quickly, but you cannot replace a fighter pilot in less than a year. And so that, the Pacific side of the second phase of the war was also over in 42, but of course there was a lot of terrible fighting for it to end, but it did end in May and August of 1945. I think what's important for our considerations here is that first of all, America played a much larger role and from a much earlier point in the second phase. And it was basically our equipment and our troops which were turning the tide in both the Pacific and the Atlantic areas, and therefore our voice in the councils were much stronger. And we hear a lot about the greatest generation. The greatest generation is the generation that won World War II, and that's true. But an added reason that they are the greatest generation is that they also won the peace. They avoided all the mistakes that had been made in 1918 and 1919. And not only did they do that, they started doing that before the war was over. In 1944, Allied economists met at Bretton Woods in New England, and they mapped out the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD, whose role would be to rebuild all countries destroyed by the war, including Germany and Japan, including enemy countries. They organized the International Monetary Fund, which would provide a method by which the competitive devaluations of the 20s could be avoided. On the financial side, on the trade side, they began the negotiations that eventually led to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which in turn led to has led over the last 40 years or so to a lowering of tariffs around the world, which has brought to everybody an unprecedented degree of economic well-being. And finally, early in 1945, they met and formed the United Nations. So they were building the peace before the guns had stopped firing. And they built it brilliantly. And it lasted. It is essentially, it's just now beginning to break up, you'll be happy to know. That whole concept and all of those organizations were extraordinarily effective, say from 1945 until 1995, say for that 50-year period. They're not as effective today for a variety of reasons, but I won't go into that. So, the second phase of the 100 Years' War had ended with both a military victory and a diplomatic victory of huge proportions. There was just one problem. There was a bad guy still standing, and that was the Soviet Union. And the United States, who had seen the Soviet Union and acted with the Soviet Union as an ally in World War II, very quickly became disabused because of Stalin's aggressiveness, first of all in Eastern Europe, and particularly where Poland was concerned, which is the reason, after all, that the Allies originally got into World War II. The Russians had made a series of agreements at Potsdam and Yalta, which they ignored. And it very quickly became clear that although the guns had fallen silent, the pressures were still there. At that moment, we were very lucky in that a brilliant Foreign Service officer named George Kennan was the Deputy Chief of Mission in Moscow. And in 1946, he sent back to Washington in February what has now become known as the Long Telegram, and it was long. It was 18 pages. I've seen it under glass in the Princeton Library. And, it takes a half an hour to read it. But in it, he outlined how the Soviet Union operated, what their strategic goals were, and what they would do tactically to achieve them, with great prescience. He was predicting what was going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years, and he predicted it accurately. Well, if you're faced with that kind of a threat, and you have a population that wants nothing more than to bring the boys home and to have peace and maybe another period of isolationism, and you're the president, you're Harry Truman, and you were, a honky-tonk senator from Missouri in 44, and suddenly in 45 you're president of the United States and ordering up the use of the atomic bomb and facing a very threatening Soviet Union, what do? Kennan's telegram landed back in Washington like a bombshell. Nobody wanted to hear that there was another huge threat out there that had to be confronted. But on the other hand, nobody could ignore it. And so there was a policy struggle in Washington. There really was a debate between those who wanted disengagement and those who wanted engagement, and those who wanted engagement very quickly realized and published an extract of Kennan's analysis of the Soviet Union in the X article in Foreign Affairs. I guess it was late 40, maybe it was 47, in which he outlined the threat of the Soviet Union and suggested that containing the Soviet Union was the way to deal with the threat. And that was the birth of the policy of containment. It was by no means agreed by all the people of the United States. There was a huge debate. And that debate on foreign policy came together in the election of 1948, one of the most interesting and pivotal, probably the most important election since 1860. In any case, the political forces were as follows. On the far left, you had Henry Wallace and the Progressives. The Progressives included the Communist Party of the USA, CPUSA, which had 8 million members, the Socialist Party of the United States, and the left-wing Democrats. It was a potent force. I mean, it wasn't going to win, but it was going to make an impact, and it did. In the left center, you had Truman and the regular Democrats. In the right center, you had Dewey and the engagement Republicans. To the right of them, you had Senator Taft and and I was born in Ohio and know the Taft family. You had Senator Taft and the isolationist Republicans. And to the right of him, you had Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrat Party. Here we are faced with an existential threat, and the nation is divided into 6 pieces. Does that come out right? 5, a lot. And what happened in the event was, and foreign policy was a part of that. The progressives wanted to join the Soviets in peace and harmony forever. And the centrist Democrats and Republicans wanted to engage the Soviets by containment. The right-wing Republicans wanted to ignore the world, and who knows what Strom Thurmond's foreign policy was, but it could not have been very enlightened. In the end, the left got about 8% of the vote. Strom Thurmond took the 6 states of the original, or 5 or 6 states of the original Confederacy, and he took them out of the Democratic column. And in spite of that, Truman beat Dewey by a narrow margin. And the reason Truman beat Dewey was because the Taft Republicans stayed home. They didn't vote. It's one of the great ironies of history. Those who were most against engagement provided the means by which an engaging president, Harry Truman, won the election. Well, he won it, and he proceeded from that point as if he had a huge public mandate, which he did not, but he proceeded as if he did. And in the next 2 years, under his leadership, he and his political allies, and with the support of what do we call them, the Dewey, later Eisenhower Republicans, put in place all of the institutions with which we fought the Cold War. In 1947 and 48, the Department of Defense was created by statute. The United States Air Force was made an independent arm by statute. The CIA was created by statute. And the Marshall Plan was established in law. All of this, the Truman Doctrine was announced and carried out, under the terms of which we helped the Greeks and the Turks opposed communist insurgencies in their countries, and he had no congressional authority at all to do that, but he did it anyway. And by 1948-49, the Russians helped a lot by doing two things. One was by executing a coup in Czechoslovakia and assassinating, I believe it was Jan Masaryk, who was the son of Thomas Masaryk, who was the first president of Czechoslovakia, or maybe it was the other way, the first names reversed them. But anyway, the foreign minister of Czechoslovakia, who was a Democrat who opposed the communists, fell out of the top story of the foreign ministry. He was thrown, okay? And then the Soviets instigated the isolation of Berlin in an effort to force the Allies out of Berlin, and we countered with the Berlin airlift. But by this point, there were very few people in the United States who did not understand that we were in for another tough slog, and that World War II wasn't the end. In many ways, it was the beginning. Well, over the next, let's just say arbitrarily that 48 was the beginning. Well, let's say that 46 was the beginning of the Cold War, Kennan's telegram. For the next 35 or 40 years, we engaged in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and to some degree with China and other communist countries in Asia, but that was basically a secondary front. The real front was Europe. And the first thing that happened was that a line was stabilized with NATO on one side and the Warsaw Group on the other. And there was a certain degree of safety because the two nuclear fleets, air fleets, whether planes or missiles, counterbalanced each other. So there was a series of proxy wars in the Third World. Some we won, some we lost. There were many wars. I see them as battles within the third phase of the 100 Years' War, but you know, for a guy that fought in Korea, it was a damn war. For somebody that fought in Vietnam, it was a war. They were big battles, is what they were. And some of them we won, and some of them we lost. But basically, we kept our power centers intact. And what made us strong were three things. A political system that was democratic. We could change leaders without having purges and murders and abrupt and inexplicable changes of policy. And we had a free market economic system, and that is a powerful tool which the Soviets never had. They basically had a third world economy. My colleague, the French ambassador in Upper Volta, used to call them Upper Volta with atomic weapons. And I thought that was understating a little bit, but now in retrospect, I'm not so sure. In any case, over the years, in these ups and downs, I would argue that our nadir was the Carter presidency and the latter half of the Carter presidency, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and the President of the United States said, "I am shocked that they have done this." And then when the terrorists in Tehran seized the American embassy and held my friends and colleagues hostage for 444 days, that was the bottom for us. And we reacted as a people to that bottom by electing the second great president of the Cold War. Truman was the first, and that was Ronald Reagan. And Reagan, within a very short time, revitalized the economy. He said it was morning in America, and the people believed him. He rebuilt the defense establishment. He rebuilt the diplomatic and intelligence establishments, and we went on the offensive. And it became apparent to the Soviet level of leaders who took over in the 80s, it became apparent that they were not going to be able to keep pace with the United States if they didn't have an open system. You have to have a system that allows the capitalists, the enemy, to put money where it can be most effectively employed. You have to have an open system to have original scientific development, and we just developed huge leads over the Soviet Union in the economic and technological areas, and their political leadership knew it. And when Gorbachev came to power, he did the logical thing. He tried to open up the Soviet Union with perestroika and glasnost, because the successful execution of that policy had a chance of revitalizing the Soviet Union. The status quo did not. The problem was, once he'd opened the door a little bit, people began crashing through that door. And between 1989, when the German wall fell, and then the other countries of Eastern Europe declared their independence, and the Soviet armies withdrew, and then the outlying socialist republics of the Soviet Union, the Baltics and the Stans, declared their independence, and then at the end of the day, what was left was Mother Russia. And on December 31st, 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved by its own decree, without one atomic bomb being set off, or the Great Tank War and the Fulda Gap in Germany, or any of the other things that had been predicted did not happen. The Soviet Union disappeared. And not Russia didn't disappear, the Soviet Union disappeared. And with that, the 100 Years' War of the 20th century was over. And we won. And if that's triumphalism, I don't give a damn. We won. They lost. And there are very good reasons for that. And you should study them. I mentioned them earlier. The best political system, a democratic one. The best economic system, a free market one. And the best technology, an unfettered one. That particular war is over. In my judgment, my prediction is that the 20th century is going to see another 100 Years' War. And I think it's probably already begun. It is going to be the 100 Years' War against Asian tyrannies. And Asia begins at Beirut and includes all of the Arab territories and everything east of that through China. And I think it's incumbent upon your generation not to fall victim to what George Bernard Shaw said, a famous, I think it's an aphorism. Anyway, he said, what we fail to learn about history is that we fail to learn about history. I reject that. I fight against that. I'm trying to inform you about some history today so you won't fail historically when your challenges come. Thank you.